Hey folks, I'm going to LinkedIn for a question, and this one started off great because they said, and I totally missed the title, but they said, "Hey Nick, sorry about the clickbait, I hope it worked." And it did because I missed it, but it would have worked if I saw it anyway. They said, "Why was Razer abandoned by Microsoft?" So obviously they're trying to get me to be like, "What the hell, man?" But their question's awesome. So they were saying they don't feel that AI is going to be taking jobs at this point, like sort of like replacing software engineers, right? So, but what would my advice be to someone who is a senior developer that's not specifically like an AI engineer, but they want to start incorporating some type of AI into their skill set, right? And they went on to say, I don't want to be behind, but they also don't want to just like completely transition into like I'm going to go be like a working in machine learning or like specifically in AI. And I think this is probably the case for many people, right? I think there's a lot of people coming into the industry where they're like, I see that this is an evolving space and I want to make sure that I am essentially like, I'm kind of starting out. I'm going to jump onto this, whether it's a trend or they see it as an opportunity. And there's probably a lot of people who are already senior developers, or they're already on this path, or they don't have any interest in completely pivoting because they don't think that they need to. And I agree, I don't think you need to completely change what you're doing, but I think how we're building things is going to change. And I've kind of made videos and stuff about that before. So before I get into answering this person's question with my perspective, and I have a little bit of AI assistance because why not leverage some AI to answer a question about AI? There's probably an Ice Cube meme in there somewhere, right? So just a reminder, if you want your questions answered, leave them below in the comments or do as this person did, message me on social media. You can look for Dev Leader, which is my main YouTube channel, or look for Nick Cosentino on LinkedIn. It's a premium profile. You should be able to message me. And if you message me, I will keep it anonymous. This person said they didn't care, but I'll keep them anonymous just because that's how I be doing it. Okay, so to kick things off, I'm going to mention I have pulled up on the screen behind me that I asked ChatGPT. I said, "Hey, like, what things would you recommend that someone focuses on?" And I had a couple of things that came to mind. And this did a better job than I could think of. But the couple of things that came to mind for me, because I don't want this to be about like tooling, because I've made other videos on that. I think we're all kind of being bombarded with different tooling and stuff like that. There's Cursor, there's Copilot, there's whatever LLM you want to use to ask questions. There's like I use V0 Dev for front end development, which I do very little of, but I use that if I have to do any, because then I don't have to think. There's a million options, and every day there's a million more, which is super cool. There's lots of new stuff coming out, but I'm not going to make this video about that. I wanted to try and make it about if you are a software developer and you don't want to get left behind, what should you be doing? What should you be doing? Sorry, I can't speak properly, apparently. Now, before I jump into some of the topics, I will mention that I think trying to familiarize yourself with some of the tooling is one such thing. I'm not going to focus on the different tools, but I think that it's important that's something you're considering. And if it's not feeling so good right now, like, hey, it's not really effective for me, I can't find the right tool, or it all seems to suck, I would say don't give up on it, because the rest of the industry is investing significant resources into this. And we might be experiencing a bit of a bubble effect, but I don't think this is one of those things where, like, in a year from now, we're like, we're going to give up on AI. If I had to bet, it's probably not going to be that. So I would at least not give up on trying to familiarize yourself with tooling. Now, the couple things that came to mind for me, because I'm thinking as a software developer that does not want to pivot over to being, working specifically in machine learning, if I'm going to build software that's leveraging AI, like, what things would I consider? And the three things that came to mind, I think there was three, was RAG, so retrieval, I think it's retrieval augmented generation. It's on this list. Yeah, that's what it is. Acronyms. I work at Microsoft. Everything's an acronym. literally, and I still am not good with acronyms. So retrieval augmented generation was one thing that came to mind for me. Vector DBs, so being able to sort of, what's a good way to say this? Like being able to index things so you can do semantic search on them. That was the second thing. And then the third was like this idea around like agents. Now, all three of these are things that I have not personally spent significant time on. So I'm not about to sit here and speak to you like, oh, I'm an expert on these things. In fact, after I get through a playlist on my main dev leader channel that looks at like repository design patterns, because it's .NET focused, Entity Framework Core, Dapper, I'm going to do some caching and stuff. I have a big playlist that I've written on my board that I have to film. Once I get through that, I want to go back to looking at semantic kernel and trying to build some more things that are focused on things like RAG, that are focused on vector databases, and then being able to do some work with agents. I want to make that video content so that I can do, like, kind of force myself to learn, and then at least get to a point where I can showcase to other people, here's how you set these things up in a simple way. So that's up and coming for me. It'll be over the next few months that I'm kind of dedicating more time to that. But these are at least things that I'm aware of that I think could make significant improvements in terms of the things that we're trying to build, or at least significant opportunity. So to touch on these three things, because, and I'm sure people watching this, I'm sure there's plenty of you that have way more experience so far in your development time than I do in these areas. And that's awesome. Like, I personally don't have time for this unless it's like my spare time, like right now, right? But I'm making videos instead. So I'm either building my own things, which will start to incorporate more of this stuff. So I'm either doing that or I'm filming stuff for content. In my day-to-day work, I'm not really doing this kind of thing. You might get a chance to do that, which is awesome. Or you have other spare time for building projects and stuff. So anyway, with retrieval augmented generation, the idea is that, and I think a lot of people have this misconception, like, if I want to use AI, I need to train it on all my data. Like, that's what needs to happen. Or they'll say, I need to fine tune it on all my data. And that's not quite accurate. And again, for those of you that are, more experienced than I am in this area, my understanding at least is that when we want to think about training or fine tuning, the best example I've heard of this is like you're trying to teach the AI like skills, right? So the analogy I heard before was like, imagine, and it's a stretch, but hear me out because it seemed to click really well for me. Imagine that you needed to train AI to be able to tie shoes, right? So the act of being able to take laces, tie them together into a bow or a knot or whatever, like that's teaching it to tie something. But then if you said, okay, well, now I need it to go tie a knot on a rope or something, like it's already learned the skill of tying, so you wouldn't have to go retrain it to go do that. It already knows the skill, so you would give it some other type of data and say, you already know this skill, I will ask you to tie this, and it would be able to do it. Obviously, I'm talking about like a physical example, but that's really the analogy that I was given. And I thought that made a lot of sense because otherwise, it's like, for example, I'm using Copilot when I'm coding. Copilot is not retrained. The entire model is not retrained on my code base. The entire model is not fine-tuned on my code base. But I'm assuming, and I don't know the details behind it, but I'm assuming there's some type of retrieval augmented generation going on where it's able to get context, and we're going to talk about semantic search in just a moment, but it's able to get context from my code base. This is why you'll hear people saying like, oh, there's a meme currently going around where someone's complaining like, what is it, like Claude wrecked my 4 months of progress or whatever, and it's because the whole code base doesn't fit into like the token window. And so that's kind of circulating. I don't even know what the original context is. I'm sure it's taken slightly out of context, but the idea being that like to do that, it's essentially taking context. It's not even using, in that example, it's not even using RAG, but RAG would allow you to go basically search for relevant context, provide that into the prompt, and that way when you're asking the LLM for some some response, you're giving it this extra context to work with that's relevant. So again, it's not retraining, or you're not retraining the model, you're not even fine-tuning it, because it knows the skills. Maybe in some context you do have to retrain it. I can't think of a good example, especially for what I'm talking about right now, especially if you were trying to do like things on code, or you have a knowledge base or something. Like, this is the kind of thing where it's like, give it extra data to operate on, not to train it. So in order to make RAG work, and again, based on my understanding of it, we need a way to be able to go find the relevant information. So again, the whole point of this question, right, was like, what things should people be focused on and like trying to learn about? I would say RAG is one. And my understanding is like that's advancing more and more. There's different ideas for like how you can pipeline this stuff. And I don't know, there, like, when I say RAG, I'm talking about probably something that's very primitive, and there's a lot more built on top of that now, which I have no idea about. But in order to find the relevant pieces of information that you want to go use for RAG, we would like to use generally something called semantic search. And that means that we're able to go look across a repository of data. So that could be documents. It's like, if you're thinking about a database in general, like usually if you're looking in a database, you'd be looking up things by ID, or you'd be, in this case, maybe you want to do like a keyword search. But that means we have to go look for specific words. But semantic search is kind of like the meaning of things, which is super interesting, right? Because when you go to search things on Google, it's a keyword search, right? There's a little bit more to it. It's not quite just an exact keyword, but conceptually it's a keyword search. When we're doing things like semantic search, you could take a concept. So what's a good example? Like shoe. Okay, the word shoe is different, very different than the word boot. However, semantically, they're very similar because they're footwear. And sandal is another word, right? These are all footwear. Socks, maybe. Semantically, they're probably very similar. They're used in similar contexts. So with semantic search and vector databases, what we'd be able to do is, again, take an LLM, and there's different, this is where like my knowledge is, I don't know, different models that we would use to be able to create the vectors. So they're much more effective at being able to create the vectors for us, right? And we could give it the data, say, create the vector for this, and then we would store that in a database. Then we use semantic search to be able to do, well, given a vector database. My understanding, by the way, and I don't know this for sure, but similar technology I've seen when I was working in forensics is something called photo DNA. And just to touch on this, photo DNA was a concept that allowed you to do like almost like fuzzy matching for pictures. So if you wanted to go find a picture that was the same, traditionally you would have a hash of the picture, and the hash values would match. You'd say that's the exact same picture. But as soon as someone changes one bit, literally one bit in the picture, you have an entirely different hash. And to your eye, it might be identical, but the hash is completely different. So the idea with photo DNA was that it would basically normalize the picture, and then it would create a vector on that picture. And when I say a vector, if you, again, I don't know my entire audience, right? So I want to explain things in a little bit more detail. Think about in math class, if you have like a three-dimensional vector, right? You're going to have three numbers separated by commas, and that'll give you your like x, y, and z axis. So, and the magnitude on those axes. So with a vector, what we're able to do is basically have many more dimensions. So it gets kind of weird to think about in like physical dimensions. So don't, unless your brain is this big. But the idea being that you can still do a distance between vectors, that aren't 3 dimensions. They can be like, 140 dimensions. You just you use the same algorithm to be able to calculate the distance between these. So my understanding is that with a vector database and doing vector search, it's essentially doing a distance calculation. So how they create the index, though, is probably going to be highly optimized to be able to get this distance to work fast. Because I think if I had to go build this, I wouldn't know the right algorithm to do to store that effectively. But that's the general idea, is that it's something like a distance search based on the vectors that were created. And those vectors are created by a model. So maybe that's not a good way to explain it. But we can use vector databases and embeddings to be able to go support RAG. So this is another entire area. If you're thinking about building software and you're like, okay, we're going to use RAG, so retrieval augmented generation, we need to be able to index large amounts of data because whatever we're building would leverage that. Then like these would be 2 things that I think would be awesome to learn more about. Because even as I'm trying to talk to you about it, like it's probably obvious. I know a little bit about it. Conceptually, I understand how some of these pieces work and how you could put them into a system, but I don't know the details about them. I'm absolutely not an expert. And so for me, this is an area I certainly need to spend more time on. I'll share an example. Like if I had infinite free time, something I would love to do, and I don't know if I've talked about this on this channel, but I have like a 20-year-old project that's a role-playing game. And I would personally love to get more time back for that because it's just fun to build. And one of the things that I started to work on was some of the world-building tools for that game. And that's because I was getting to the point, like, I've spent so long building these systems, and, like, there's no content in the game. Like, you actually can't play anything, so it's like, okay, well, where's the game? And I'd be like, no, but you have to check out the inventory system and how the items work and how the skills work. You'd be like, that's cool, man, but like, it's just a console app, basically, right? It's just fun to build the other stuff. So I started saying, okay, well, let me start building some world building tools. And one thing that I really wanted to do was essentially create like a repository that's like the history of the world that's for the game, and that would have like the geographical areas, like literally describing the world, and then there would be like characters or people from history and events that happened. And I stopped doing this really when, like, I don't know, probably a couple months after like ChatGPT and all this stuff was really becoming popular. And I was thinking like, man, it would have been so cool to like basically use RAG, right? So have all this stuff indexed. And now that there's agents, which is the next topic, like, what if I had agents that could basically go start creating the history of the world, right? I could tell them, I could instruct them, like, you are a world builder for this role-playing game, and give it some guidelines, and then set it off and see if it can go start creating content for the world. I would love to see what it's able to do. And the cool thing is, like, given that I would have authority over it, I could say, like, if they're building up some of the history and I'm like, I don't like that, I just remove it from the history. And then I could update the instructions to say, hey, like, don't make history that's like this, or give it better directions. But if I had infinite free time, I would be having AI agents help me build my role-playing game, at least for the content. I think it would be super cool. So that brings us to agents, though. This is, again, something I don't have like much experience at all about. I can't even remember what I used. Was it LangChain or something else? But basically, I whipped up something that was like clone the repository and updated some of the prompts to be able to have a couple of agents that could work together. And I think for this, it was kind of like to write an article, right? So like I had one agent that I could instruct that was like, hey, you're able to use a plugin to go to the internet. So you're going to go do the research. And it's going to be the agent that can go collect information. And then another agent was like the manager. I heard in some of these examples, it's like good to have an agent that can help coordinate between the other agents. I still don't really know what value that adds. Like, can't they already talk to each other? Like I said, I don't have a lot of experience doing this. I had another agent that was essentially the content writer, right? And then I think there was like a fourth agent I was trying to do that was like a fact checker or something else. And I was trying to say like, hey, here's a topic. I would like you to go write an article about this. And the results I had were quite lackluster, and it's really interesting because in some of the tooling you can see like basically it outputs the conversation and you can see how these agents are talking to each other. It's kind of funny. And I'm not a very good, prompt engineer, but there were sometimes I could see them talking to each other and I'm like, based on what you just told that other agent, like I really have a hard time believing it's going to do a good job. So I could imagine, for people that are really good at generating prompts, like you need to give your AI agents enough sort of understanding to be able to almost like prompt each other more effectively. So maybe that has to do with having, better roles defined and stuff for them. But I think this is a territory that is going to be incredible. I think this is the area where people are like, this is what's going to replace all the software engineers. It's just going to be a bunch of agents. I have a hard time believing that you're not going to replace whole teams of software engineers with this, at least no time soon. But I think that if there's ways to build these types of systems, I think that could be super interesting to focus on. What comes to mind for me, though, that's a little bit of a sort of a it's a bit of a conceptual jump and I'm not sure how to make it. Is like I'm thinking about how I build software right now, like the different types of systems I build. I think when I think about AI agents, I'm thinking about them being the ones who are help building the system with me. But I'm trying to shift my mindset around this of like if I'm building some software, I have a software system, it does whatever. I always use the example of a Pokédex, okay? So if I were building a Pokédex and it was a web application, there's a database to store the Pokemon I've seen, like how would I put AI agents into that? And what would they do? Like what would their purpose be? So I'm trying to wrap my head around, I don't just want agents for helping me write code or something. I would like to find ways to build software that leverages agents. And it's kind of the same thing like with LLMs in general. It's like the use case that everyone goes to is I'm going to have chat. Like I'm going to have like chat support on my website or chat support in whatever. And it's like, yeah, like that's the use case we've seen a million times. So how else can you go build stuff integrating an LLM? And in my case, I'm saying, how would I put agents into a software system? So I think my perspective is like those three areas as a software developer, I think are going to keep growing like crazy. I'm sure there's others too. But those are the ones that I'm personally very interested in. And I would say if you're a developer, probably learning and understanding and how to integrate those and leverage those would be a great opportunity to focus on. I'm going to jump over to ChatGPT output here and go through this list. So RAG and vector databases with embeddings are the first two that came up. The third one they have is fine-tuning and prompt engineering. So yeah, like I don't have good examples of where I understand where fine-tuning would be helpful. The example I gave earlier, I was talking about using RAG instead of fine-tuning. I still haven't seen a good example where someone's like, the cost to go do the fine-tuning makes it worth the result that it would have. So I don't understand that. So again, that would be great for me to learn. Prompt engineering in general, I think, is one of those things that like we should all continue to get better at. I certainly have a ton of room there. Especially when it comes to like structuring output. Like I've tried, if you think about it, if you're building an API, for example, you have full control over like how you want to format the result object that you're sending back as a web request or whatever, or even in code and not over the web. So when you start putting AI in the middle of that and you're like, by the way, this thing that speaks English, format this data for computers. It's funny because if you give it examples like format data this way, it can do a pretty good job. But I've seen, like, even with prompts that work most of the time, I've seen it sometimes go, like, certainly I'll format my output properly for you, and then also adds the output, and you're like, okay, but I can't parse that whole thing programmatically because you added in some extra sentence. So the better you are at prompt engineering, I believe the better that you can work around some of these weird, like, nuances. Certainly, I've not perfected it. So, next on their list, number 4 was AI agents, and then they say multi-step decision making. So maybe that's like better framing when I was talking about, like, how do you integrate agents into a software system. The multi-step decision making is probably part of it. So they say autonomous AI agents. They list out LangChain, AutoGPT, and I haven't heard of Baby AGI, whatever that is. Something to go look up, right? So can perform complex workflows by breaking down tasks, retrieving information, reasoning through problems. And then they say learning how to create agents that can act on APIs, databases, or external services expands the utility. So again, some of those things that they said, I'm like, I could think about how I would leverage the agents to help me build, but how do I make a piece of software that is already leveraging those? In semantic kernel, one of the things, and I've made a video about this on my main YouTube channel, is like you can drop in plugins that allow the agents. So when you're asking the LLM to go perform or give you a result, you can give it a plugin that enables some ability. So it can call some code that you give it, which is super cool because as soon as you can write code that's called by the LLM, now you can go wire it up to whatever you want. So I think there's a lot of really cool stuff to build that way, and I want to spend more time on that. Next up on their list is data pipelines and feature engineering for AI. So they say well-structured data pipelines are critical for feeding high-quality data to AI models. Interesting. Okay, so engineers should learn how to pre-process, clean, and transform structured and unstructured data efficiently while understanding feature engineering concepts that improve AI performance. So, yeah, I guess in general, like, I mean, I've given AI some pretty unstructured data and it does an okay job, but I guess when you're talking about in volume, you want to make sure that we can give AI, sort of transform data that's normalized. I also wonder if this means for, especially like on the training side, it's one thing where it's like you already have a model and you're trying to interact with it, but especially for training and all of that, I can't imagine what has to go into that. There's another item a little bit lower on this list. I'm just going to jump to it now, but they say like AI ethics, bias, and explainability. So, I mean, I think that's super interesting. If you're spending more time building stuff with I think that could be really important to understand. They have AI-powered search and recommendation systems. So this is kind of what I was talking about. So they say search and recommendation engines powered by AI. So then they say semantic search with embeddings. They say hybrid search using keyword and vector methods. Okay. I can imagine in this space there's like some really advanced stuff that is way over my head. Yeah, and they say those things are increasingly common. Like, yeah, that's the normal stuff now. So engineers can explore different technologies for this kind of thing. But yeah, I think, we have the concept of search already built into a lot of software. And so AI powered search and recommendation, I could see that being, instead of just keyword search and then having fuzzy search, like now it's like truly building in semantic search and having that done effectively. I think that could be super powerful. They talk about model deployment and optimization. So this is something I don't have any experience with. So deploying AI models in production requires knowledge of inference optimization. This is like stuff way above my head. So, for example, quantization, distillation, pruning, okay, and serving strategies like OnX, TensorRT, and serverless AI inference. I got some learning to do. So engineers should also learn about frameworks such as Triton, Inference Server, Hugging Face, Inference Endpoints, and Vertex AI. So yeah, like, again, but if you're building systems that are leveraging AI, then I could imagine that this is probably something that you'll at least be more and more exposed to. This one's interesting, multimodal AI and vision language models. So I don't have like any experience at all aside from like using like Dolly to go generate, or I guess it's just built into ChatGPT now to go generate pictures and stuff. Like I don't have any personal experience with leveraging LLMs to go like do anything in other modalities aside from text. So I think there's a lot of interesting things that could be explored there, because when I think about leveraging AI in software systems, I'm imagining that we have, I don't know a good way to explain this. Like when we're building programs, it's like we have programmatic interfaces between things. But suddenly we can cross different modalities when we have models that can do it, right? So like one of the earliest things ever, like way before having LLMs and stuff, was like text to speech and speech to text. So I remember being a kid and like trying to build, one of the first things I remember trying to build, I was like, what I want to do is I want to have like voice commands for my computer. So I want to be able to like, speak things and have it do it. I remember being able to get my driver's license and being like, oh man, I want to put a computer in my car and I can like talk to the car and have it do things. And then, I mean, we have all this stuff built into our phones, but you can use, like, that's a different sort of mechanism for like interfacing with technology, right? And I just imagine that when we have more and more opportunities with like multimodal models, that we can start doing more and more interesting things. So tons to explore there. And then the last thing they have on their list is just AI augmented code generation, which is kind of what I was saying earlier with the tooling, kind of staying on top of that. So I'm not going to dive into that. But I thought that was a pretty interesting list. Like I said, I had a couple that came to mind for me, and there's definitely a handful in there that I'm like, basically zero experience with. So to this person that was asking how, they don't want to switch to doing machine learning, they still want to stay as a software developer, but don't want to fall behind. I'm hoping that that's a helpful list, at least to give you an idea of different things you could go look at. For me, even just speaking to all of you, going through that list and even refreshing my mind on, okay, like, what's the last thing I built that used RAG? And like, I bet you if I went to go re-implement something now, the tools that we would have available, like, instead of me having to go cobble something together, there would be like, just use this package and it would do it a million times better than you could, even a year from a year ago. So lots of interesting opportunities, and I certainly have to follow up on a bunch of what's been said in this video. So hope that helps. And just a reminder, if you want questions answered, leave them in the comments. I'll try my best. And then otherwise, you can look for Dev Leader on social media. Send me a message, or Nick Cosentino on LinkedIn, and I'll keep it anonymous. And the more you write, the more detail you add. If you have career problems or things you're trying to figure out, feel free to elaborate, and it'll be totally anonymous. So thanks so much, and I'll see you next time. Take care.